think I was in an interesting group because it was mostly kind of funders and commissioners and kind of from the other side to where I am. So it was really interesting to hear. I think one of the things that came across really strongly was actually, the lack of capacity and the constraints was on that side as well as any other side, and I think Emma was saying that, the stuff that she wants to implement because of the stuff she's heard and the stuff she knows is still limited by the kind of grown-ups who don't buy into it. So, we're all kind of facing these issues together. And also the other comment I think was really important is that, it's just as much of a risk for funders to distribute long-term funding as it is for us not to receive it.
Yeah, I will do, and I think I'll pick up a little bit on Rayaz's last point. I think as a community leader of a community organisation, I'll start by saying what we really talked about was actually how difficult the commissioning role is. That you have got public money to allocate and you need to be accountable for. You've got a finite pot of money, so you've got to prioritise where that goes. You can't fund everything, and you've got legal restrictions about how that money is allocated. And what we saw through COVID was the last two of those, there was a bit more money and there was a bit less focus on restrictions going away, and we saw the benefits. But we also accept that the commissioning function is a very difficult one. But at the same time, it's beholden on me as a community sector leader to say, well, as community organisations, we feel that pressure of being accountable for public money because we've got to use it. We also feel acutely, if not more, accountable to our communities themselves, because without their buy-in and their trust, we are nothing whatsoever. And we also have our own legal landscapes that are difficult. We're trying to be independent. We're trying to be true to our articles. So it is very difficult. So it isn't that this is really easy and straightforward. But what we thought we need is much more focus on relationships, not forms, much more focus on shared vision, that we need to be about cooperation, not competition. And we need to be hearing the voice of communities much more in the decision-making, not necessarily as formal roles as consultants, but as in talk to our community groups, talk to our community organisations who can let you know what local people think and ask them early and not when you've already got made up your mind.
So I guess it was such a great discussion. Just in terms of an issue that didn't really come through the prior sessions that I wanted to highlight that a few people talked about was just it's actually really difficult for even really grassroots community groups to reach the people who very much most need that help. And an example was given of holiday activities, and actually families with really, really complex situations couldn't access those activities because it wasn't necessarily the right intervention. And I thought that was a really interesting little vignette of how sometimes the thing on offer even with the best will in the world doesn't correspond to the community's needs. But I really want to focus on the dreaming section because it was really powerful. So really what we talked about was power and relationships. And there were some just great observations from the group. A phrase that came up from one group member that was parity of esteem, and ensuring that there is parity of esteem between everybody. So as Brendan's saying in the chat, it is we. And one observation from another group member was that language can be a real power tool, and that using language that excludes people and people find difficult to understand can be a really good way of shutting people out of that power. And finally, seeing is believing. So having that trust, which links with that parity of esteem, actually just building those relationships face to face.
I think similarly to a lot of other groups, our initial discussion was kind of around the parameters that are put in place as a result of funding. So therefore, the restrictions become frustrating in terms of allocating funding. The monitoring makes things very difficult to proceed, and it ends up feeling like there's more work than the actual project itself. And prior to COVID, now having those less restrictions has meant that funding is able to be distributed quicker, and kind of releases a bit of the pressure on that. But similarly, alongside that, we spoke about how actually there are concerns around relationships within funding. So if we take this relationship funding approach, does that mean that we are then going to end up missing organisations because we're not aware of them? So then when we were talking about dreams and what we can change and how we think it could be more beneficial and productive, we spoke about research showing that actually funding is about consistency and long-term presence, and that currently funding doesn't do that very well. But could we possibly look at longer-term funding, seeing that actually we're not looking too much at R&D, and that also noticing that we need to try and alter funding processes for smaller grassroots organisations who understand. So we are taking more of an approach of doing with and not to.
I think a theme that came out in both of our sessions was how can we look at what we share in terms of values and a kind of a mission with commissioners and with different community groups, rather than perhaps focusing on how we're different, that actually we're collaborators, not competitors. We talked a lot about long-term relationships and funding. Somebody said in our group they'd almost rather have less money for longer term than more money short term, because that allows you to plan, allows you to have invest more in your staff and your team. And this sense that there was an unhelpful divide in commissioner between the funders and delivery organisations, that what we needed to move to was a sense that we were all sitting around a table trying to work it out together, trying to sort out what the problem was, rather than jumping to the solutions and the funding before being really clear what the problem is and how to best tackle it. So a sense of co-production and working together rather than having a separation and a divide.
We decided that we'd like to make some changes, but we'd like to do it in small steps, but do it quickly. Let's not hang about with this. Let's not just sit back and talk about it for the next, meeting after meeting again. Let's do it quickly, and let's do it through a leap of faith, both of us. And we'd like it to be based on trust, obviously, between, all of us. And we'd like to do it in lots of conversations and not reports. The other thing was, Riaz said something about if he's got somebody what's based in Matson, he'll phone me and he'll send it to me and so on. And as I was sat there last time listening to Riaz and looking around the room, there was people I could name, and then there was names I recognised. And the names that I recognised were the funders. So I don't know them, but I recognise their names. And I think I've always had the opinion that our funders have always been, and if you are a funder, okay, I do love you all, don't cut me off, right? But you've always been kind of like the enemy to me. You've been like the enemy. You stop me doing what I want to do, what my community needs. You're that person what's stopping me doing it. So you've always been that sort of mythical enemy person that I throw things across the office with. So it's like, do you know what I mean? Now today I'm going, oh, poor Mary. Look, this poor woman. Do you know what I mean? And I'm understanding today what you go through and what problems you've got. And I understand that. But you could come and talk to me. Let me, be that person what comes to visit me or visit us projects, and let me know you by face and not just by some name on the bottom of an email or a piece of paper. So we kind of went down that road. We'd like some clarity on, if I need some funding on a certain thing, who do I go to? You know who to come to if you want to go to Matson or White City or Trebworth or whatever. I need to know who I want to go to when we need some sort of some funding on certain things. And that was it.
So we looked at how bids are evaluated, what we've learnt from the pandemic that we can go forward with, the fine balancing act that lots of district councils have to manage. Where are we? A lot of the things that are commissioned are actually already in the community, rigid terms of bid assessments, all sorts of other things. I'm going to pass over to Colin for part two.
Thank you. So we decided that it was quite hard to know where to start in completely restructuring the commissioning of services, because statutory funding is so deeply embedded in a particular culture and approach. And a couple of points that were made across the group: if the commissioners spent more time talking to us and developing a relationship with us, and we felt that we had a shared understanding and shared ambitions and were able to have honest conversations, then we could really build that relationship where we're on the same side, we sat around the same table. And I know, because this works for us very, very well at the district council, I won't mention any names because I don't want to embarrass Emma Keaton-Clark, but it's so wonderful to be able to sit down with a commissioner and talk in that way with somebody. And if we all were able to have those relationships with all the commissioning bodies and and statutory agencies, it will be a wonderful world. The other point that I brought up was the fact that commissioning is often done as though there was a massive amount of fraud, and that the commissioning system is designed to prevent local charities from defrauding the public purse. And I think the amount of fraud in the funding process is absolutely minuscule and minimal within the county. And it seems to me that if we could have some system whereby we can accredit local organisations who are known and who are trusted and who have that relationship and that track record, so that they can in some way be fast-tracked or passported or be given quicker and easier access to more flexible approaches to funding, that seemed to us to be a fairly safe and fair and fairly radical way of approaching things.
So I won't repeat stuff that's already been said. I think one of the things that came out strongly from ours was, as people have said, relationships, but also from that relationships, the fact that during the pandemic, the sort of institutions were not the thing, the people were the thing. And from that, we started to talk about, well, if we use terminology like particular institutions or communities and forget that there are individuals behind these, then we don't start to build the relationships in the way that we need to. But also people were talking about developing people's freedom to act. So what can people actually do might be different than what people think they can actually do, either as funders or community organisations. And so we had examples of people saying that rules around funding haven't been reviewed in years in some organisations, and there are spurious rules that people just follow because that's what they've always done. And so people don't actually necessarily understand their freedom to act and to do things differently. We also talked about coordination discussions, as everyone else has said, at leadership at place, but also whether we can push that up the leadership ladder even nationally about doing different things and not in silos as well. Probably haven't done justice to it, so sorry guys.
So I think we came away with the kind of overarching message that actually our challenges are similar, and that there are more similarities in the challenges we face than differences, and we all feel that pain. So the more we can do together, the better. So lots of stuff has already been mentioned. We talked about the uncertainty of agendas and how long the agendas of groups last at a local level against kind of government national agendas. And if commissioners don't have certainty of agendas, then they can't pass that on. So that's an issue. And also about commissioners, we assume they're decision makers, but actually that isn't always the case. They don't certainly feel like decision makers. And although that's kind of changed and relaxed during COVID, and people did feel more empowered and a little bit less risk adverse, it's kind of reverting back. We talked a lot about relationships, and actually relationships being fundamental to everything. And that co-production that Pippa mentioned, we talked about that. And we are beginning to see some of that, but we need to understand that and see that more. And that is about inviting everybody in and problem solving together. And Hannah said we need to invite diversity into thinking. And I think that's the key thing. It's our problem solving. It's how we all get together and we problem solve together.